Welcome to the Italian Wine Podcast. This episode has been brought to you by the Wine to Wine Business Forum 2022. This year will mark the 9th edition of the forum to be held on November 7th and 8th of 2022 in Verona, Italy. This year will be an exclusively in-person edition. The main theme of the event will be all-round wine communication. Tickets are on sale now, so for more information, please visit us at winetowine.net.
Welcome to the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm Cynthia Chaplin, and this is Voices. Every Wednesday, I will be sharing conversations with international wine industry professionals, discussing issues in diversity, equity, and inclusion through their personal experiences working in the field of wine. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe and rate our show wherever you get your pods. Hello and welcome to Voices. Today, I am so happy to welcome Miguel de Leon to Voices. Miguel was born in the Philippines, and he moved to California when he was 10 and graduated from UC Berkeley with degrees in linguistics and urban planning. But it was his job at a neighborhood restaurant that changed his path forever and sent him on to New York, where he has created a restaurant and a wine career that is nothing short of amazing. And he's worked at the likes of Momofuku and Casa, and he is currently the extremely award-winning wine director at Panisse, which I have never eaten at yet, and I can't wait to one of these days. And he gets described as having soulful comfort food and wine pairing menu, and he's earned the restaurant a really great place on the New York Star's wine list. So these days, Miguel needs a wheelbarrow to cart around all of his own accolades that he's won in recent months, including Imbibe Magazine's 75 People Working for a Better Drinks World, and Michelin Guide Sommelier Award in New York, and the James Beard Award for his essay on intersecting identities and decolonization. And best of all, most recently, he was named one of Wine Enthusiast's Future 40 Tastemakers and Innovators. So I am really glad that he has even half a minute to spare for our podcast today, because I've been wanting to talk to Miguel for ages. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's a huge pleasure. And I have to say that is the longest intro I have ever had to give on Voices. You've been wine director at Pinch Chinese now for almost 6 years, and you're doing so many cool things there, championing female winemakers and New York state wines and natural wines, among a lot of other things. So I'm just wondering where you get your inspiration for your award-winning wine list, and what lights you on fire about a new wine? What makes you think, I have to have this, it has to be at the restaurant?
There's a few things, really. In terms of inspiration, I find it literally everywhere. Sometimes it'll be from a museum visit. Sometimes it's from reading a book. Sometimes it's with conversations with friends. Sometimes it's just challenging the notion of like, what can exist in this category? So for me, it can really come from anywhere. One of my favorite kind of like recent things that I started really kind of focusing in on. And I think, you know, if you're writing a wine list, you have to be mildly obsessive about something anyway.
Absolutely.
I was fortunate enough to travel to Austria this past March, and it was just an eye-opening experience, obviously considering, you know, how none of us were able to travel for the past 2 years, and then to kind of experience falling in love with wine all over again in a really kind of visceral, agricultural, and through a farming perspective. So I thought that was really magical, especially going through, you know, some of the more vanguard Austrian winemakers who were, you know, doing biodynamic preparations and doing a little bit more kind of like interesting things with farming and minimal practice. So, you know, thinking about how that can read on a wine list. Ultimately, if the stories that I want to tell all have a similar theme, then I think that's a really wonderful goal for a wine list to have. And I know that a lot of people don't really put that much thought into a lot of that kind of stuff, but you know, that's the artist at heart kind of speaking.
No, absolutely. And it does, I think all of us in the wine sector, or even just, you know, wine enthusiasts, you know the difference when you're reading a wine list and you want to take it home and snuggle up in bed and read it as if it were a book, or just, a list of, well, I could have this or I could have that. So
yeah, exactly.
That effort really makes a huge, huge difference in the experience of reading one of those lists.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also just a lot of fun I like breaking form, clearly. I mean, I was clearly very inspired in writing my first wine list by Paul Greco of Terroir, and how he kind of formatted, this change of how people talked about Riesling, for example. And Paul would put like encyclopedic things on his wine list. And I was like, this is crazy. I've never seen a wine list like this before. And then even looking at, say, like traditionalist wine lists and seeing that there wasn't really information, those lists to me, I don't like a didactic wine list where there's only one way to take it in.
Exactly.
I want you to have a little bit of involvement. I feel like wine is always a conversation. There's a reason why bottles are shaped the way that they are, and it's because we need to be able to share them. And I think the same way about, curating a list of 400 of them, and that's 400 plus conversations at least that we can maybe have, and that's just on what's available. Not to mention like the greater world of wine. So that's a really big impetus for me. What lights my fire about new wine specifically is if it's especially delicious, and I know that what's going on behind it coming into the restaurant is something that I can fully appreciate and defend.
I'm really excited about this conversation because I think people can get too wrapped up in talking about wine in particular ways, and some of those ways are quite exclusive. But I like that some of your criterion has to do with being especially delicious and having a good story to tell. Those are the things that make wine, relationship builders and community builders. Wine was invented in the first place so everyone could sit around a table and drink it. So especially delicious, I think, has to be a wine list criteria, or in my book anyway. So, but you said something interesting about wines in an article that I read. For wines on your list, the wines that you choose for Pinch Chinese have to be defensible at every turn before you'll put it on your list. And I really like this concept. So I'm dying to hear you explain it, sort of spin out this philosophy in your own words for our listeners.
Sure. So obviously it starts with that deliciousness thing, right? But that's us meeting halfway, right? That's the halfway point of me interacting with that wine. It's had a life before, and once it meets up with me, then it'll have a life after. But to consider that part beforehand, right? And so in terms of being defensible at every turn, I mean, well, was the land treated fairly when this grape was being grown? Were the people who were tending that land treated fairly when this was being grown? We forget sometimes that wine is the sum of a multitude of thousands of human decisions, right? It's a human consequence. Like there's no such thing as grapes being turned into wine just because. Like you don't pick, right? You don't pick a bunch of grapes and then all of a sudden it just turns into wine. That never happens. That's the mistake that a lot of people make, right?
No, people forget. Yeah.
Exactly. And not just that, there's also that notion that like as soon as it's pressed, it's just going to make itself. Maybe for some people that's their philosophy, but you also end up making very flawed wine at the end of that day. But to me, that's where the defensible things come in. And I mean, okay, well, if you've treated the land right, that's a great step. And then if you've treated your people right, that's another great step. And then maybe if you're thinking about, if there's a lot of bigger picture things that align, then I think I can absolutely tell your story way better, because those are also things that I firmly believe in. And so it just so happens now that now we're talking about things like social equity and justice and diversity in the spaces, and that's an even better story to tell, right? That we get much more color, and for us to be so obsessed with how a grape grows, how a vine grows, I think we can also be as obsessive with, say, how your vineyard workers are being treated, or how recyclable your items are in that cardboard box. So all of those things come together as part of that defensible route. If am I teaching my staff all the right things? Am I teaching my staff historically contextual things about, agriculture in California, for example, if I don't include, the Chinese Exclusion Acts, or how we were denied Filipino rights in San Francisco? Those things get glossed over. And yes, they're part of our history, and some people don't want to talk about that in wine, but I think it paints a much better and much more complete picture when we do that. And that's what I mean by defensible.
I am so happy about this. You're completely singing my song. And I agree with you entirely that there are a lot of conversations in wine right now that are pretty uncomfortable. clearly you're talking about some specific ones in California that a lot of Europeans definitely are not familiar with. And it's important to have that backstory. It doesn't have to be the fulcrum upon which, the bottle is going to tip up or down, but having that backstory, I think, gives people more vested interest in what went before and what could come after in the right hands. So I completely agree with that. It's an interesting concept, and also how wineries are engaging with their vineyard stewards is equally important. So I like defensible. I'm going to steal that term from you, I think.
Please, please. I think the more people think about what goes on their wine list, right? I think a little bit of thoughtfulness goes a really long way.
Well, and there's a difference between sustainable and defensible. I like that term.
One is a very passive way of looking at it. And defensibility is you taking a very active route and making sure that your stakes are just as high whenever you're putting something on the wine.
That's true. I like that. It's more active. Yeah, it is much more active than passive. That's really, that's very insightful. You have got so much going on besides doing that. And I love the fact that you're educating your staff about this, by the way, but we'll touch on that later. But outside the restaurant, you are also, terrifically busy with a ton of projects. And I know our listeners are going to want to hear about this. I want to start with the article that you wrote for the James Beard and other writing that you've been doing lately, because you describe yourself as a wine professional of color, and you joined a white-dominated industry at a really young age, and you became very successful. And now a lot of your writing, and it sounds like a lot of the talking that you're doing and educating that you're doing as well, focuses on those issues of social justice and equity and the sort of systematic inequalities in our own sector. So I'm curious as to, what sort of spurred you on to take up these topics. As we were just saying, they're not comfortable. They can be awkward. They can make people be very divided in their opinions and in what they are willing and not willing to say. So were your own sort of personal early experiences in the industry something that pushed you on to do this writing and to achieve and aspire in the wine world? Or, how did you get to that point where you thought, I'm going to write about this and I'm going to put myself out there? Because it's a brave thing to do.
I just wanted to be honest with my wine experience, really. Obviously, a lot of my early formative wine experiences were kind of coded within that white space. I was fortunate enough to be in a really kind environment when I was learning about wine for the very first time. The very first person who took me into wine was Jonathan Waters at Chez Panisse, who's a wonderful man. And I miss him dearly, but the idea of a very kind of, call it like a very open-armed look at how people come into wine, right? I knew nothing coming into that space. I knew that wine was a very rarefied thing, and it was expensive for me at the time. And for him to just be like, we have all of these wines open. It's for everybody here to kind of understand what they're trying to sell, but also kind of make you have a connection with what we're trying to do here at the restaurant. So that I've really taken that kind of experience. And at the same time, after moving to New York, kind of realizing that, it's an industry first, really. And then to make it even more lonely is that I tended to be the only person who looked like me in wine classes and certification programs in places where bodies were legitimized in this space. And I've worked in New York wine now for about, 16 years. And it's just now that we're kind of starting to talk about, Miguel's getting all these accolades. I never, thank you for the recognition. But, when you just put your head down and work and do the things that make you happier because you get to be yourself fully in this space, then imagine the possibilities if we just allowed that from the very beginning. So, a lot of my experiences that I wrote about they're painful. They still continue to. I have a wonderful therapist that I talk to about this, every so often. But it's been a long time and it took a long time for me to kind of to get out of that mentality of that I wasn't worth it, or that there wasn't a group of people who weren't around me. And so just by kind of being a little bit more active and finding my own community and trying to see what it meant to just be myself in a space where I didn't have to, take my earrings off or get a haircut or lose myself in a personal identity kind of fashion when I was engaging with wine in a professional setting. I think that's all I wanted to speak about. That got fast forwarded when Julia Coney started speaking about, her experience, her black wine experience after George Floyd was murdered. And really that kicked my ass into saying, well, I know that I can do more. And very quickly I was like, well, what are the things that we're not talking about? What are the things that I've experienced personally that I have a little bit of beef with? What are the things that my friends and I always talk about after we come away from a wine tasting and say, well, that didn't feel right, or like that felt off? We always had these little debriefs ourselves, and then I just aired them out. And you know, if that kind of honesty is the thing that's going to get people to pay attention to something like that, then let's all get louder. Let's all talk a little bit more shit. Let's get a little bit more angry, because then it could be better.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely in agreement. Just if you're willing, and obviously we all understand that it is painful and these things are challenging because they are real, and they don't just happen once in our careers. They happen over and over. But one example of one of the things that you and your colleagues and your friends would find that was off, because I think it's important to talk about these so that other people can say, yeah, hey, I thought that was off, and if Miguel says it was, then I can trust my instincts.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a couple of ways of going about it. It's, if we're going to a wine tasting every once in a while, if we were traveling as a group, for example, we'd notice that we would get much shorter pours than people, and so that was key. And we were all buyers at that point too. And we were like, okay, well, I guess we're only going to taste a little bit of this wine, as opposed to how everyone else is getting treated here. The second was like a very clear denial of our just existence. Until we got to the front of the line, no one would acknowledge us, or unless someone who was very clearly a person of influence would come up to us, no one would pay attention. And so we just started to say, you know what? Well, if that's how it's going to be, then we're just going to go organize our own thing. We'll taste these wines with our reps, and maybe that's the only way that we'll experience these. We've stopped. I mean, there were a few of us who just absolutely stopped going to wine tastings because of that kind of mentality. And for those of us who do continue to go to wine tastings, it's a very clear kind of protocol. We'll check in with each other, we'll see each other at the door, we'll walk together as a group, and then kind of leave together also. So there, you'll notice when the people who look like me in that room all kind of gather around and talk amongst ourselves about what's going on. It's because it's the same idea of why you wouldn't maybe want to talk to a certain producer because they were doing something skeevy, or it's a similar kind of whisper network that we're developing. It's just that it's much less coded because it's much more explicit. We can't turn off being brown and black on a selling floor.
Of course not. And yeah, but I like the way that you've developed a strategy to push back, in a way that is clear and intentional, but it's not confrontational. It's so important. It's, there's using our voices is really important, and using it in a way that gets our message out firmly and loudly, without becoming part of the problem.
I mean, I will ask more of my white colleagues if that's anything to take away from this, is that, your brown and black colleagues are tired. We're very tired. The last 2 years have been harrowing for us. And if there's any way that you could use your body or your position to make sure that we get a little bit of ease, that's something. That is absolutely something.
Well, I am a white cis woman, and I can tell you this is why I do what I do, because I think, well, it's our job to shine lights on this. It really is, all of us. I will never have your experiences, but I can shine light on it where I think it's sitting in the darkness and it shouldn't be. So, and I think more people need to do it. And, as a woman, of course, as I said, I'm a white woman, so that made life easier. But as a woman, I've been passed over, ignored, I have made myself be quiet when I probably shouldn't have felt that I needed to. So I think it's my job, it's my honor and my privilege to be able to shine light on things that, my colleagues need help with. And like your writing, as I said, it's brave. There are always going to be haters and judgers out there, but people need to hear it. It's encouraging, and it's getting back to your staff, educating your staff and being a role model, and using your voice is going to be hugely helpful. I mean, I'm sure you have a very diverse staff.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, that's just a consequence of us trying to find, people who are maybe didn't have any habits about how to talk about wine. I think it was very conscious decisions to bring people up. A couple of our Psalms that we've had come through Pinch were, they were our bussers, they were runners. We really want to invest in this idea that that you can learn about wine through any channel, and you don't need a pin, you don't need a certificate. It might help you in the long run because that system probably won't change for a while. But at the end of the day, your education personally is way more meaningful, because of the relationships that you make and how you speak about it. And for us, it's just really finding a way to empower people with the kind of vocabulary that they already have. You don't have to learn wine speak in order to love wine. And consumers can do the same thing. I feel like every time you present a guest with a wine list, it is intimidating to receive a document that's 300 wines long for you to choose one for the night. And all we want to ask is, there's a reason why there's somebody whose job it is to guide you through this. And if you trust us enough, we'll find the bottle for you. Promise. And we don't ever have to say it's dry or it's funky or I want something that's red that tastes like this. There's a Obviously we talk about education as a platform for people to understand wine through a much more kind of like academic way or a much more standardized way. But when we standardize something, we also flatten that human experience of something, right? You have to sacrifice a little bit of that individualistic artistic expression if you're going to standardize something. But there's a reason why a McDonald's tastes the same way in Italy as it does in the United States. But at the same time, if I were making Sangiovese, say in California or in Texas, it won't taste the same as the Sangiovese that you're having in Lazio, right? Those are completely different places that have their own vocabularies about something that's there. And in the same way, I just want to make sure that it's not about demystifying wine either. I hate that term. Like, wine should be romantic and mystic and magical. It should be. It's pleasurable. It's hedonistic at the end of the day, right? But there's an allure to it that we need to keep. We are, as sommeliers, we're storytellers and magicians at the end of the day, right? I need to make sure that when it pops something open, you're not just going to fall in love with it. You're going to figure out, how did I find that for you? And it's part of that defensibility strategy that I was speaking about earlier. Well, it's because I've done my due diligence and I've hidden the rabbit in the right portion of the hat for you to not see it well, where everything feels like a surprise, right? And that surprise might come from Hungary, from Georgia, or from a region in Germany that isn't all that celebrated. So that to me, that's the idea of giving people this kind of power of speaking about validity and emotion. And wine should elicit things in us. It is a powerful thing. There's a reason why people write about it in poetry, because it is artful, but it's a personal human connection, right? Your tongue and your brain exist in your head, and I the only thing that I can do is maybe suss out the closest thing of how you approximate what I'm tasting. And in that there's poetry, in that there's magic. And that's the education bit that I want to do, because it's not helpful for me if I tell my students that Bordeaux is a place in France that they'll never visit. You can just tell them, hey, Bordeaux is a place and it gave us this, but now we have to react to like the very modern consequence of what that means. So, well, here's Bordeaux. It's a place that gave us this kind of wine, but now it's also going through these kinds of things, say like a drought, or say like a lack of migrant labor, which also affects, say, like the price point, its perception, the very clear kind of class divide within the chateau system. So all of those things together make for a richer story, obviously, but also have a really deep impact on how someone perceives about Bordeaux. It's not a rarefied thing. It's not something that's stuck in time. Wine has to be evolutionary, and education can be too.
Italian Wine Podcast, part of the Mama Jumbo Shrimp family.
Yeah, that is such a great message. I love just the simple power of that message, that wine should elicit some things and it should have some magic, and we don't need to strip that away to educate people. I think that's a very very good starting point for any wine conversation.
I think whenever sommeliers deem themselves experts, like that's the red flag, right? Like I like absolutely not knowing everything about this journey. I like that there's still a big left turn that we can make and not know where we're headed.
That's my favorite part of being in this sector. I know you're working with the Hugh Society as well, as part of their resource council. And I'm a big fan. I love the core values of the society, creating equitable spaces and redistributing power, and sort of developing a toolkit for, advancing people who have been unrepresented, BIPOC people, LGBTQ people, getting them involved. So I just want to know, what's your role on the council? What are you doing to help out? I can tell you're a great educator. I love educating too. So when I heard about you getting involved with Hugh and starting a curriculum, I thought this is going to be awesome. So I want to hear what you're doing there.
Yeah, so kind of a little bit of what we've been speaking about already. My role specifically is to kind of help develop curriculum and national development for the chapters that are opening.
How many chapters are there now?
There's more than a few. We're opening up. Today's September 9th. Tomorrow, September 10th, we'll be opening Nashville.
Wow.
So, already existing, there's New York City, there's Philly, there's Atlanta, there's Texas, there's Northern California, there's South Africa, there's DC, and we're looking to open in Chicago very soon. So there's a lot of places where there's a lot of folk who just want to have community in wine.
That is fantastic.
And all I want to do is make sure that whenever someone starts this talk about, I want to learn more, that they're learning through a lens that they know, that they don't ever have to change how they think or they speak about wine, how they don't lose themselves. Back to that idea of that.
Completely agree. And people's memories and experiences play a huge part of how they learn about wine. Trying to wipe those out is a big mistake.
Exactly. There's a wonderful movie coming out called Blind Ambition that features four Zimbabwean.
I know.
Yeah, and so these four Zimbabwean sommeliers who, for their 3-4 years coming into wine, and now they're kind of going into the World Wine Tasting Championships, right? There's a few scenes in there. Specifically, there's a sommelier named Tanashe Nyamadoka. He's based out of South Africa from Zimbabwe. And in a few key scenes in that movie, it seems as if he and I wrote the same article, right? He describes, going through his grandfather's forest trail as they're foraging for things. And he says, well, this is a fruit that only grows here in this part of Zimbabwe. And that is a kind of tree bark that only I can understand. But whenever I go into a space and they say blueberries, raspberries, like he had to go buy that at a grocery store. And I went through the same thing. I was like, I grew up in a very tropical place where blueberries didn't exist. I didn't know what a currant was. And I kind of still don't know what a gooseberry is. I kind of have an idea now.
Does anybody know what a gooseberry is? I lived in England for 17 years. Is anyone sure?
Yeah, I kind of have an idea now. I think they look like mini tomatillos.
Exactly.
But it comes back to that, right? It's that let's use your kind of vocabulary of growing up into wine. I tell my students a lot that like specificity is a good thing up until it's not, right? And in the same way that like there's no wrong answer in wine up until there is a very wrong answer in wine, right? So when we talk about things like, well, what are you tasting here? It's not helpful for me to kind of hear about, how your aunt's perfume closet or whatever is that thing that you're smelling. It is helpful for me though when you say, it reminds me of this brand of perfume. Then we can kind of come to some sort of like middle point there. And that even just that level of understanding of me needing to know, right? Or wanting to know, really. If the thing that makes your hair curly is the thing that you're smelling in that wine, what is that? Like why is that the thing that gets you there? And how is that sense of memory then tied to what you're experiencing? Because then that could be really joyful.
And inclusive. It makes people feel vested.
Absolutely. Because then we don't have this idea of, I don't know what that is. You've just told me what your reference is, and now it's my responsibility as the person educating you to meet you there. And a lot of teachers, I think, look at this top-down philosophy and say, well, that's not how you should be teaching. You should be teaching about France and the AO system. It's like, why? I live in America. Most of these kids, and honestly, most of the people that I'm gonna be teaching, maybe travel isn't part of their vocabulary. Maybe travel is something that's like really exclusive for them. It's hard for them to kind of think about spending money to go to a wine place.
So what does your new curriculum look like? How are you driving this into it? I'm so curious.
The first thing that we're doing is recentering the space, right? So kind of making sure that whenever we step into the space, before we even talk about anything, it's kind of having an understanding that what you're going to say here isn't dumb. The only dumb question is the one that isn't answered. And that there's a vested interest in both of that I expect you to do the work because you're expecting me to teach you. Right. So it's a very mutual understanding of like what education looks like. The second is kind of how we speak about wine. Right. And so this idea of decolonization is that for a lot of folks, it sounds like very like hokey race theory. But at the same time, it's like, how is it that the market of wine can adjust very quickly versus the education of wine? So we can't. It seems to me that we're obsessed with this idea of Napoleon splitting up Burgundy, and that's why we talk about it that way. But
which is so tragic.
Exactly. But when we talk about American wine in the normal wine context, right, we spend one day as opposed to the 6 weeks of France that we usually study in. And I mean, like I said, I teach mostly Americans, and I'd rather have them understand like what's in their backyards first and how we talk about that, and say, okay, well, you're in America. If you want to be a wine person, let's find wine that's around you, because then that also creates a more interesting economy of what's available. I think people pay attention now, at least here in New York, to wines that are domestic, but not your like blue chip domestic places, right? So yes, there's always going to be Napa Cab and Oregon Pinot, but now we can also include that, New York Riesling in that conversation. We can include wines from Texas in that conversation. We can include hybrids from Wisconsin in that conversation. We can talk to people in Missouri, in Ohio, in Virginia, who are making exceptional wines, world-class wines.
Yeah, the only time we ever can say thank you, climate change.
Yeah, but also at the same time, thinking that climate change is part of the curriculum. Do you see? So it's understanding that all of these things have intricate parts. Wine is a big freeway. It's a big freeway with a lot of potholes. We just have to choose the lanes that we're going to go on. And we want to make sure that...
I love that metaphor.
And we want to make sure that everybody doesn't feel those potholes in the same way, right? To me, if you're a white person, you have a really wonderful giant rig that can smooth over those potholes really well. You're not gonna feel them so much. But most of the time, if you're a brown person in wine and you feel lonely, you feel like you need to spend the money to get a certification, you're already on the furthest right lane trying to cut in. Your car doesn't work all that great. Maybe it even has a bumper missing. You can't pay for the insurance, and your steering wheel's only like a third there. So how can we get to that place where we're in that fast lane to get there? And this is one of the ways that we can think about it, is that if education can reframe just by location, for example, if I'm teaching you wine in Texas, why won't I teach you wine from Texas first?
Quite right. And it seems so obvious, but it has never been obvious until now in wine education. It's a really modern approach.
It's because there's still this kind of like really fantastical hierarchy of wine being a Eurocentric cultural thing. And for Americans to be very quickly consuming more and more wine every year, it's also kind of wonderful because then there's the demands that a consumer has can also be placed on education. It's not just the academic part of it. It's not just this very cut and dry, this is the AOC kind of chat. It's also, well, this is the AOC, and maybe part of the AOC can demand that their migrant workers be paid fairly. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Like, I think there's an education evolution that we have to consider, because education is consequential. And I think if you're educating somebody correctly, even if they don't go into wine, maybe they go into something like public policy, that affects winemaking too, right?
That is so true. And we need that to happen more and more often. I think, people's view of wine education is so narrow. And I think what you're doing is really, as you said, widening the highway. That is incredible. I like that. And the evolution, I think, really has to happen. I mean, it's very easy to get stuck. And we were, and to a certain extent still are, in most of the world, stuck in a very old-fashioned, traditional, elitist style of wine education, and it just doesn't work for everyone anymore.
Absolutely, it's kind of understanding that even education within education, right? That finding that people learn differently and people need a little bit more time. If you have dyslexia, then there's a way for you to kind of get the information to you, and it's very similar with wine. Maybe it's not the traditional route that we need to understand first. Maybe we're teaching people about biodynamics from the very beginning, and then kind of seeing what the consequences of the land look like when you're not treating it that way. So it's a much bigger conversation, but at the same time, it's wonderful and engaging when students ask about sustainability first, say, and not the particulars of a place because of variety. Grapes are grapes. Sorry, like at the end of the day, grapes are grapes, and we can be obsessive about like that Macintosh versus Fuji versus Gala analogy, right? But if it's not worth it to me to put that in my body if I know that it's being rounded up with pesticides and covered in all sorts of gunk. I can talk about that with my students very clearly from the beginning and say, wine looked like this when it was first being made. There's some wine that kind of looks like that now. And how do we get to the messy middle? And that's an important thing about education also.
Well, you've walked right into my trap, because I wanted to hit you up on what you see as some of the biggest issues facing the industry right now in terms of climate change and sustainability. We just started to touch on it, but I know you've been writing a lot about it for New York Times and Food and Wine and Bon Appetit and things. And I really want to hit you up on what you think, aside from the fact that we do have this education problem, which we're all working on. But what do you think the biggest issues are facing the industry in those areas, climate change and sustainability? And as you said, the consumers are becoming much more aware and rigorous in their demands and what they're willing to pay money for.
I think it's just being savvy about where you put your dollar. We keep saying that food is political, and it sounds a little hokey sometimes, but it is. And where you put your dollar really goes a long way in terms of what it is that you buy into. So it's things like, for me, the biggest questions, obviously, right, climate change in the bigger scale. Within your local economy, it's talking about what kind of labor goes into making the wine that you like, and maybe demanding more of that, having a fair, transparent.
And do you see that in consumer behavior? Are you actually seeing that?
I mean, for one of the first questions that we've started asking as a group of somms here in New York is, do your vineyard workers get access to health care? That's never been asked before as a tasting note, mind you. And it's not really on technical information, right? But again, if we can be obsessive about how people treat vitis, we can be absolutely obsessive about how people treat each other. And that's one of the first things that we can do is say, how human is this wine? Right? All the decision making that we've asked before, how human is this wine? And then how human is it? There's a really wonderful quote that Ariana Occhipinti says, and it's that we're not inheriting the land from our ancestors, we're borrowing from our children. And that's something that we need to kind of recontextualize here too, right? Yes, it's climate, but also it's how we're responsible about this thing. And it's agriculture.
It's all those Sicilians. I think she stole that from Alberto Tasca.
I mean, probably.
They do feel the same. And I think it's again, in Italy, and particularly in places like Sicily, where, viticulture is pretty hard to do. It's true. It's this tradition of understanding that, the earth that we have is the only earth we're going to get, and taking care of it is crucial.
And that's a very decolonized way of thinking about it, right? Indigenous peoples before us came and have proper relationships with the land, right? If you look through some texts, a lot of First Peoples here in America, for example, consider geographical features as like family members. They're the brothers of the river. They're the sisters of the canyon. So, and there's ways that we can think about that as well. Is that if you place environment in this kind of familial notion, wine becomes a really interesting thing on how you communicate with one another. But sorry, to get back to that question of about, say climate change and sustainability, there's a lot of things that kind of tie into that also. Climate justice is environmental justice, is labor justice, is migrant justice, and all of that stuff as well, right? Like in order for wine regions, for example, to compete with migrant labor, if your harvests are all getting earlier and earlier and earlier, who picks that stuff? Who ends up bearing the brunt of that work? And that's something that we always have to remember. And not just that, what kind of danger are we putting these people if it's earlier, which means that it's drier and there's wildfires? What does it mean for terroir to kind of accept that? And so those are big questions that I think are challenging, because I think the question of terroir, it's not just time and place, it's time and place and people in kind of like this consequential like domino effect, right? And terroir, we can't think of terroir as a fixed thing. I think we have to understand that like terroir also we're just seeing this kind of very slow but very true change within like this geologic time, as opposed to like the way that we experience it, which is a very short human time. Maybe it's just now that we're experiencing the consequence of terroir 10,000 years before.
Well, I work with Professor Attilio Scienza, who is one of the living legends of geology in wine. And he would like to give you a big hug right now. I think you've hit on a topic that, is too deep for us for today. I mean, no pun intended, too deep. But it's true, terroir is not as superficial as we've been led to believe in the past. So it's important to keep our eye on so many conceptual aspects, like a multifaceted gemstone kind of a thing. Before I let you go today, I was just going to ask you, if you were going to give a piece of advice to a young brown or black person, and I'm sure you give pieces of advice all the time, if they, somebody who wants to enter the industry in any way, shape, or form, as a producer, as a som, as an influencer, or a TikToker, or, a writer, whatever, into hospitality, what would you tell them to do to get their feet on the path? What would you suggest, advise?
Put both of your feet on the ground and think about intent. Intent is something that you can taste. Intent is something that you can feel. Intent is something that you can receive as a person. And so when we talk about this intentionality of making delicious wine, we're also talking about the intentionality of how you make that delicious wine, right? And so if you're going to come into this, think about why you want to come into this. Is it because you think that this is exciting and this is something that you're going to be... For me, it's the reason why I wanted to get into this is because I could learn forever. And I like being an eternal student.
The best teachers are eternal students. I really think that's true.
I love being an eternal student because you're never narrowing your scope, right? You're always expanding your vision. But that also means that you get to include as many people in that vision with you.
Well, I don't think we're going to get anywhere better than that. I am so grateful for this conversation, Miguel. Truly, you've added a lot of learning objectives to topics that, are being covered now and need more attention, but you've added some new lanes to the highway for sure about the conversation that I will take forward with me. So I'm really grateful. And thank you so much for your time.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was wonderful.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode brought to you by the Wine to Wine Business Forum 2022. This year will mark the 9th edition of the forum, to be held on November 7th and 8th, 2022, in Verona, Italy. Remember, tickets are on sale now, so for more information, please visit us at winetowine.net. Hi guys, I'm Joy Livingston, and I am the producer of the Italian Wine Podcast. Thank you for listening. We are the only wine podcast that has been doing a daily show since the pandemic began. This is a labor of love, and we are committed to bringing you free content every day. Of course, this takes time and effort, not to mention the cost of equipment, production, and editing. We would be grateful for your donations, suggestions, requests, and ideas. For more information on how to get in touch, go to ItalianWinePodcast.com.